From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinion featured in JAMA.
Hello, and welcome to this JAMA Author Interview podcast. I'm Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo, and I'm the editor-in-chief of JAMA and the JAMA Network. I'm speaking today with Dr. Derek Angus, professor and chair of the Department of Critical Care Medicine at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. Dr. Angus is also a senior editor at JAMA. We're speaking about a special communications published in JAMA that Dr. Angus authored with colleagues, including myself, titled The Integration of Clinical Trials with the Practice of Medicine, Repairing a House Divided. Dr. Angus, thank you for joining me here today.
Oh, Kirsten, it's lovely to be here.
Wonderful. Yes, let's do first names. Okay, so we all know that randomized trials are important for generating the evidence that we use to guide the practice of clinical medicine. They're our gold standard. JAMA devotes a lot of pages to publication of clinical trials, as do many major medical journals. So what's our problem here? We know trials are important. Why are we devoting so much attention to the fact that something is not working exactly right here?
Yeah, it's a multi-part problem, but at the heart of it, we're living in this strange paradox where, as you alluded to, we think of clinical trials as the gold standard. We throw a huge amount of money at clinical trials. It's as much as $80 billion a year. And yet, in the end, we're still not getting the trials we need to drive practice. Clinicians in journal clubs everywhere will read a paper and say, yeah, that doesn't really help with the clinical problems I have. We have something like 100,000 new trials are filed on clinicaltrials.gov every year, and yet you would think that would be enough, and yet there are so many clinical decisions that we face today for which there's no good evidence. The U.S. Public Health Service Task Force continually issues guidelines in which the vast majority of the guideline statements are not informed by randomized trials. Clinicians are seeing patients all day long and making as many as 100 decisions per day. And in one study, only 3% of those decisions were based on evidence.
So, and you work in the critical care space. I'm a general internist, so we see this across wherever we practice in the landscape of medicine. We might have trials for a particular question, but then we don't know if they apply to the patient or the scenario that we have in front of us clinically. And for other sets of decisions, we have no trials at all. So you describe in the special communications sort of big categories of where trials are falling short compared to the decisions we face every day in clinical practice.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a strange thing happened. About 4 or 5 decades ago, at the beginning of the world of clinical trials, Archie Cochrane, he was the namesake for the Cochrane Collaborative, and he was one of the world's first trialists. He was part of the Bradford Hill initial trial of streptomycin in tuberculosis right after the Second World War. He wrote in the early 70s that really there was so much uncertainty in clinical practice, we should try to have every clinical decision informed by a clinical trial. In other words, he envisioned this constant R&D function where clinicians would always be searching to find the right way to take care of patients and would do a trial to find out. But somewhere along the line, we created 2 parallel worlds. We had the clinical practice world, and then we had the clinical research world. And then accidentally, through a whole bunch of things, including, for example, the Belmont Report, incredibly well intended, but including many other things like we have the NIH to fund trials, and then we have Medicare to fund practice. We ended up creating 2 parallel worlds. And to a certain extent, the 2 worlds, they don't talk to each other. They look similar, I'm sure if you had a conversation at a dinner party with your relatives not in healthcare, they would all assume that clinical trials are working on behalf of clinical care delivery, but actually they're not. They have become two parallel universities. And so you asked me, what are the things wrong with clinical trials? I can list the many things that are not working with clinical trials, but it's kind of a pox on both our houses. The problems lie with the trialists doing trials that are good for trialists, but not necessarily good for clinicians. And then the clinical world engaging in clinical care without really feeling like they need to rely on clinical trials. So both sides have sort of lost sight of the other.
Yeah, it's a great point. But we have heard over the past decade or maybe more of phrases like the learning health system, the system of caring for patients should always be learning. And the way I think about learning health systems involves doing these types of learning from doing within designs that might give you an answer to a more relevant question to the practice or your care of patients. In what ways have those types of efforts fallen short?
Right. So I would argue that Archie Cochrane was essentially describing a learning health system in the 1960s. And the reason we have the phrase today of the learning health system is because no one got the memo. And a learning health system is exactly what we would want. If you start with the assumption that there's lots of things we don't know, and then you say to society, what's our job? Society would say, do the best you can today, but please also learn as fast as you can so that when my child gets sick tomorrow, you'll be doing something better than you did today. Because tomorrow, I don't want yesterday's care.
Absolutely.
So a learning health system, even though some people think the phrase is a bit cute and a bit new, I would actually say the phrase is a label for what healthcare should always be. So then the question is, are we getting learning health systems? And the problem there is that several things are in the way of truly integrated learning health systems. There are ethical challenges. There are challenges about whether we have the right study designs that function most effectively in learning health systems. There are challenges to having the data systems within these learning health systems really support learning. And then finally, there are challenges about incentives, because these two parts of this house divided, clinical research and clinical care, are essentially incentivized in many ways to do everything except have a learning health system.
You bring up the pandemic in this special communications, and I think of the pandemic as both teaching us lessons about how to do things really well and teaching us lessons about what we didn't do well at all when we really needed to. Describe a little bit about how that sets the stage. This conversation about trials not delivering exactly on their promise is not a new concept. We've been talking about this for a while, but in many ways, the pandemic sort of brought home both the best and the worst of that.
That's so right. So in normal times, this is like a slow moving disaster. In a way, it's catastrophic to be spending billions of dollars on trying to learn how to provide healthcare and yet missing the mark in so many ways. COVID so sped everything up that you could sort of see it on your own timescale.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly every physician in the world was taking care of patients with COVID, and those physicians did not know what to do. So there was an intense perception of, how do I treat the patient in front of me? Now, again, you could say that that's true for diabetes, and that's true for many cancers, but you don't feel your own inadequacy as a clinician the same way, but you really confronted how you did not know how to care for COVID when it was in front of you. And in response, some of the initial responses actually showed what the problem was. On the one hand, clinicians were reaching for ivermectin, reaching for all sorts of therapies and just saying, oh, I'm sure this works, and going on sort of gestalt and gut opinion and things they read on social media, etc. And I understand why they felt a huge imperative to try to do the best for the patients. On the other hand, everyone wanted to launch a little trial. There were thousands of trials registered that never got to completion. They hardly enrolled any patients. They wanted to just do one study at one institution and not at another. However, those were some of the things that we don't feel great about. But there was also use of study designs that I would say are the kind of study designs that help learning health systems, these so-called large platform trials that tried to be very pragmatic in their design, tried to be very simple to enroll at the bedside, tried to make sure that patients were more likely than not to get the therapies that were most likely to work, and then also designed to give answers really quickly and then move on to the next question. It wasn't an investigator saying, I just want to test my drug. It was in groups of investigators saying, let's test across all the possible drugs as efficiently as possible. And first of all, we got really high quality evidence very quickly, within months, the roles of steroids, of IL-6RA antagonists, also on what didn't work, like hydroxychloroquine, and pretty much all the guidelines came from these large platform trials.
So in this special communication, you outline 4 areas, both, as you stated earlier, are areas of challenge, but also areas that are opportunities. If we thought slightly differently, we might be able to bridge that house divided. So these are areas in ethics and regulation, in the design of trials, in the use of our data, our electronic health record and other types of data, and in the way we finance trials. These are areas of challenge currently, but also areas of opportunity. And these are also areas that I think we are going to have more written about in the future because we're launching a series to explore these areas more. Do you want to say any more about these 4 areas?
Sure. So first of all, you're alluding to the issue that while we despair at the overall picture, we have great enthusiasm about the road forward. And that's because the problem that we're facing is really just one of scale. Almost everything that we need to fix, someone has been fixing in some places. It's just a matter of getting everyone on board. In the ethical issues, we have issues where, in many ways, especially in the United States, our ethical review for clinical trials isn't really fit for purpose. Pretty much how we assign minimal risk is we almost never assume you can do a trial in a hospital space that would be minimal risk. There are clearly ways in which we could provide guidelines to IRBs to be much more flexible. And so, for example, the pragmatic trials coming out of Vanderbilt are examples of where you're testing among different types of usual care. Maybe these multi-page long consent forms that no one understands and that no one can even remember signing, that maybe that's not really serving the patient and it's probably not serving society in its best interest. In the study designs, always asking for the kind of study design you might need for, say, a phase 3 registration trial almost discourages people from doing the kind of research that could be done all the time. In the business world, they're constantly doing A/B testing. Little A/B tests of what strategy they should adopt. And yet think about our healthcare administrators running hospitals who are making decisions all the time on nurse staffing, on where to set up access to healthcare in certain places. And they often make those decisions on sort of gut. And yet they can be as meaningful for a patient's access to healthcare as whether a particular drug works or not. And so having study designs that are simple and quick and could be easy to reach by healthcare administrators, et cetera, would dramatically change the evidence base on health services delivery. And so on. Similarly with our data solutions, we have invested so much in our electronic health record. And although the electronic health record isn't perfect, it's an incredibly valuable source of data, one that trialists never had access to in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now here we are 20 odd years into having almost the entire US healthcare system captured in the electronic health record, and yet it's still achingly slow to try to do clinical trials fully embedded in the EHR. And with just a little bit of attention to data ownership, to standardizing data, and so forth, many clinical trials could run right in the EHR. And there are many other issues about that. And finally, I would say on incentives, there have been examples where, at least, for example, in the United Kingdom, where it tries to think about a national health system. Wait a minute, why are we not enrolling enough patients in clinical trials? And then you find that clinicians are really busy, hospital presidents don't really understand why clinical trials are important for them. They changed the financial model where hospitals themselves would be directly supported inside the national government budget, inside their clinical operations budget, if they were participating in trials that were ranked as being of strategic importance for the British people. And it dramatically increased enrollment. You could really see during COVID that even when Europe was in a similar wave of COVID, the United Kingdom was enrolling far more patients in clinical trials than other countries facing the same amount of COVID. So could Medicare, for example, think about deliberately incentivizing hospitals to participate more in trials that we thought were important for the American people? That's the sort of example of trying to change incentives that would really be lovely to see.
Yeah, wonderful. I think the important points I would underscore is that we are, in fact, optimistic. Randomization is that key element that helps us to understand when we're generating evidence in a way that really helps us to really have confidence that a particular intervention works. And there are examples of people doing things in more innovative ways, either in other countries or in specific settings here, trying things a little bit differently to address some of these areas that you've identified. And this Special Communications is just the first of a series of articles that we hope to be publishing on this topic. We hope to engage both academics, researchers, as well as those who are practicing in clinical settings, who are thinking about the generation of evidence and how it informs their practice. And I think this is a conversation that I hope more will take part in, because it's so important both for how we generate the evidence, but also how we apply it in the practice. And so it's been really fun to see so many engaged in this question. And thank you for kicking off this series with the Special Communications and for talking with me today about it.
Thank you so much, Kirsten.
This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. Thanks for listening.